the ways in which Asians are depicted is really similar to the ways in which Africans have been depicted. And so the threat to me is the threat to your identity, and so all of a sudden there's this narrative and this frame that is defining you. And so as a young person, how can you see beyond that and not allow that to restrict, who you are and who you aspire to become?
Hello and welcome to Cambridge Forum, coming to you live via Zoom. I'm Mary Stack, the Executive Director, and today I'm honoured to be handing over the reins to GBH host Paris Alston, who's going to moderate the discussion of Living in the Shadow of Our Fathers. Our guest speaker is author, educator and entrepreneur Omo Moses. He's son of the legendary civil rights activist Bob Moses, and many of you may remember the Forums interview we did with Bob back in 1993, which you can easily access on our website. In that program, Bob spoke about his work in the 1960s with early voter registration drives in Mississippi and the creation of his innovative school curriculum called the Algebra Project. Joining Omo today in conversation is Jack Tchen, the Clement A. Price Professor of Public History and Humanities and Director of the Price Institute on Ethnicity, Cultures and the Modern Experience at Rutgers University. In addition to authoring several books, including White Peril, Jack worked on the PBS documentary about the Chinese Exclusion Act. I'm now going to hand over to Paris Alston, who you all know previously as the host of GBH Morning Edition, and who has now moved on to host the newly formatted Basic Black, which will be launched in the spring. So thank you all. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Mary. Thank you so much for having me and for everyone who's tuning in this evening. And thank you to Omo and Jack for joining us for this wonderful discussion. So there's so much to talk about here, but I as we always do, we want to start at the beginning, right? And Omo, I'm going to go to you first to just let us know. I mean, it seems obvious, but truly, why did you want to share your story with the world in this way?
Yeah, great question. I remember being in a creative writing class in 11th grade. And, I tell folks I probably said about, 10 words in classes throughout high school. But, that was the class. The teacher did a free writing exercise. And so the teacher was Karen Hawthorne. And, I really found my voice, and I was able to return to memories of growing up in Tanzania and being born in Tanzania. And I just remember just the power of those memories and being able to share that with others and sharing that with my mom. And so my mom was the kind of mom where, anything her kids did, it was like, the best thing that could have been made in the world. And and so she was both my first reader and also, my first editor. But it just felt like I had something to say, and writing was a vehicle to saying it. And I didn't know what I was going to write, but I knew eventually I'd write something. And over the years, I began trying to reconnect to my journey from Tanzania to America and try to understand also how that connected to my dad's journey in Mississippi.
Mm-hmm. And Jack, upon encountering the White Peril, what jumped out to you about what Omo has given us in this story, and how did it resonate with you?
Well, first of all, it's a beautifully written piece. Omo, your teacher did great things, but you also have a gift for writing. So it was really beautifully written and beautiful to read. I think what struck me was really your reference to your grandfather, W.H. Moses, who who wrote, as I understand it, the original book called The White Peril. And that was in 1919. And that really struck me because part of the shadow that Asians in the United States live under is the same shadow that he was writing about. In other words, how the nations and peoples of color in the world were impacted by colonialism, and therefore the White Peril, as he framed it. I mean, it's well worth reading. It's still possible to find online. Um, was really something that um, basically pushed back the possibility of people of color to be able to live their own lives and determine their own futures. So that was a powerful insight, and it directly connected to the phenomena of the yellow peril that I've been researching as well.
Thank you, Jack. So, Omo, we know that your story, your existence begins in Tanzania, but so much of your family's story begins in Mississippi and is rooted there, in a place that is very different from Boston or Cambridge. And I want to get into that too. But if you first could just talk a little bit about the role of Mississippi in your family and your life and what that place gave you in your writing of this.
Yeah, yeah. So when I think about Mississippi, I think about Mississippi as the place where my family was born. And so my mom and dad met in Mississippi in 1964. My dad had been working with SNCC, but my mom came down during Freedom Summer and began organizing. And so, they met and they began, they became friends and comrades. And so that relationship obviously eventually led to us. But also, when I think about Mississippi, I think of folks like Amzie Moore and Ella Baker. And so the people that were in Mississippi prior to my dad arriving there. And so my dad tells the story of how Ella Baker put him on a bus and he went to visit, all the NAACP leaders across Mississippi. And, he said when he met Amzie Moore, he was astounded because Amzie had the plan. He understood how to channel the energy of young people that had been sitting in and have been active towards voter registration and building power. And so also, the first time that I went to Mississippi was for Amzie Moore's funeral. And so I remember a couple things. I don't know, I was probably about 7 or 8 years old. We took a train across Chicago and then down into Greenwood, where we met June Johnson. But the first thing I remember, we were vegetarians at the time. And so Mississippi was the first place where I had some fried chicken. And so that was exciting. The other thing I remember was at the funeral, there were a bunch of men in military uniform, and they gave Amzie a 21 gun salute. And I remember as a kid because, the story in the family was that, my dad had got drafted into the Vietnam War. And so he left to live in Canada. My mom was his kind of point of contact. Eventually, they went from Canada to Tanzania, and that's where we were born. And so it was hard for me to make the connection between men who actually fought for this country abroad and men that fought for democracy back home. And so, one of the stories that don't get told is how those men that fought for America abroad really came back and created space for people like my dad and young people to be safe in Mississippi and to do the work that they did. Then also, I think of when I think of Mississippi, I think of the young people that I met when I first went down there. And, I'd been playing basketball, competitively at college. That part of my life was ending and I didn't know what to do. And so my dad suggested or encouraged me to come to Mississippi with him to work in the Algebra Project. And it was really remarkable just encountering the spirit, the energy, the vibrancy of those young people and being able to build relationships, being able to teach them and to think about what are some things that we can do together to ensure that they're able to be successful in school, but also to challenge the school to change in a way that, other kids can come through and be successful. And so the last thing I'll say, and this is connecting to what Jack was saying, one of the parents of the Algebra Project, Mr. Frank Figures, is the one that introduced me to the book, The White Peril, that my great grandfather wrote. And so it was really remarkable for me in two ways. One, all of a sudden, I had a piece of my dad's story and his legacy that I didn't know anything about. And so his father passed away when we were in Tanzania. His mother passed away before we were born. And, the story had been like, all right, Ella Baker put him on a bus and he went to Mississippi and he did what he did. But he was really coming from just generations of Black folks that have been working on challenging the conditions that, we're facing in America. And so all of a sudden, it wasn't just Bob Moses. It was Bob Moses, the grandson of William H. Moses, who understood what time it was and understood, how the Black experience and his experience really connected to the narratives and the things that have been used to exploit colored folk across the country. And I was really not only across the country, but across the world. And so that was when it was remarkable for me to see him as a person that had a really global perspective of what was going on. And the last thing I'll say was that when I began writing The White Peril, Margaret Burnham, asked me what I was writing, and I told her The White Peril, and then she's the one that told me, oh, that was in response to the Yellow Peril, and that was in response to the ways in which the Asian community was being, characterized across hundreds and hundreds of years. And so I think all of that is really powerful and speaks to this moment and some of what we need to do now as we think about building bridges across communities.
Absolutely. And I want to focus on that word peril for a second, because it's alarming, obviously, right? But you both have used it in your titles, and I want to know more about your interpretation of that in this moment. And Jack, I'll start with you.
Sure. The peril really has to do with fear and deep fear of the other. And in the case of U.S. history, it was really the deep fear of those who are other than basically white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. But then as this country became more diverse with the European immigrants, it became constantly a juxtaposition of, in the South, fear of Blacks, fear of African Americans, fear of quote unquote primitive peoples. And in the West Coast, the fear of the handful of Asians, quite frankly, who were beginning to look for their futures on the shores of the Pacific coast. That fear resulted in anti-Asian and anti-Black violence, and it resulted in the Chinese exclusion laws, which were really part of the reaction and dismantling of Reconstruction. Frederick Douglass, for example, was really advocating Chinese immigration and saying that this should be a composite nation. It shouldn't be just of white people. And he really led the movement protesting these kinds of perils in the sense. So he was the good pastor W.H. Moses was really flipping that argument, saying, well, everybody's afraid of the black peril or the yellow peril. We should really be concerned about how the domination of white people who were not originally of this nation to begin with, but claiming that they were the only people who were destined to be part of this land. So he was really constantly playing with those kinds of questions about really colonialism and domination.
Mm-hmm. And Omo, how does that interpretation resonate or differ from your own?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in relationship to fear, I remember arriving here from Tanzania and, my mom placing a map on the kitchen table and really talking about you can fit so many Americas in Africa. And so really trying to make sure our point of reference for who we are and who we grow to be is Africa. But I also remember her placing, a book of folks getting lynched on the table when we were really young. And the way I think about that now is she wanted us to understand the fear and anger that is part of American culture that is a threat to us. And, that fear and anger kind of presents itself in many ways. Some of those are overt and explicit, other times they're not. I also think about it from the perspective of, it being a threat. And so, just as a young person coming over here from Tanzania, there's this push to conform. And so, when we came here, we were fluent in Kiswahili. And so my older sister made the decision like Kiswahili is for Tanzania and English is for America. And so we lost that language. The clothes, the different things that connected us to Tanzania, we began shedding those things. And so part of that I see, the other thing that I remember was just, the representation of Africans in America was nothing like what I remember experiencing and seeing in Africa. And I felt there was a lot of shame around that. And so when you look at the images in Jack's book, the ways in which Asians are depicted is really similar to the ways in which Africans have been depicted. And so the threat to me is the threat to your identity, and so all of a sudden there's this narrative and this frame that is defining you. And so as a young person, how can you see beyond that and not allow that to restrict, who you are and who you aspire to become?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Uh, you know, basketball was such a big part of your life, Omo. And when we think about basketball in the context of African American identity, there's such an attachment, right? And this is true for Asian American identity as well. I'm thinking about people like Yao Ming and Jeremy Lin, and others. And so, how did that help cement your African American identity?
Yeah. It's amazing. So we moved into Puberty Terrace, which was like Harvard married housing when we came from Tanzania. And there's a court, Corporal Burns Park. There's a court there on next to the river, and it's just a legendary basketball court. And so you would have generations and generations of predominantly Black men, but it was mixed, playing on that court. And so Patrick Ewing played there, Ramil Robinson, people like Jerry Scott. And so I remember my dad walking us to that court when we were young and just sitting on the curb and just watching these men, go at it. And we grew up doing that. And so, those men, we gave them the same names as Dr. J and Julie and, Daryl Dawkins and, Chocolate Thunder and the Iceman. And so they all became kind of our heroes. And what I aspired to do was to be able to get in the game and to be able to play on the court with them. And, we sat there for like 10 years waiting to get in the game, But once we did that, and, it's sad because those spaces are no longer there in the community, but this was a space where boys can compete against men, and really build relationships. And so it was almost like a rite of passage.
Was basketball something that was passed down through your family at all?
Yeah, you know what? I mean, my dad was a hooper and he never told me. I mean, he played at Hamilton, he played growing up in Harlem. And so, but for whatever reason, like it was like he kept it a secret. And it wasn't until I left college that I actually got on the court and played with him. And I was just shocked that, that
He's
he
like
was really
crossing you up.
good. Yeah. He was he played good defense. He was thoughtful. He was like the epitome of a point guard, and he knew how to pass and get everyone the ball. But I mean, I think so basketball was also a place where we could be free and we could attach ourselves to, I guess, the American dream to an extent. It was like, all right, we can go here, we can be free. And this was a way that we could escape, what we understood as kind of the places that society was kind of directing you. And so, the way I think about it now is that, you know, it was a space to like dream and imagine ourselves finding a way to be independent and to be have some level of freedom in this society. And so few people are able to achieve that. But I learned a lot of lessons out there on the court that I was able to apply to all the other things that I did I've done in life.
Mm-hmm. And Jack, hearing Omo talk about this as a big basketball fan myself, who played but definitely did not play past high school because they did not need me on the team. But I think so often in these identities and in our existences when we know that there are forces that are working against us, we identify with the imagery that affirms us, right?
Mhm.
Which is what I'm getting from what Omo is saying. And what imagery would you point to, whether it's anything from Yellow Peril or beyond, that helps affirm the Asian American identity and experience in the US?
Well, it was actually similar, but different. I mean, I grew up watching Saturday TV where the Fu Manchu films were, the reruns of the reruns of the reruns. And it was Boris Karloff in yellowface, right? Pretending he was Chinese and commanding these hordes, quote unquote, hordes of people to take over London, for example. That did not inspire me, nor did Charlie Chan inspire me. But it was actually the Olympics, because sports are quite segregated, as you all know, and growing up, didn't get to see Asian Americans as we do now on American teams. So it was really in the international sports arena with the Olympics that I got a chance to see Chinese athletes who are amazing. And my mother, of course, also cheered for them. I myself am someone who loved basketball, but not the greatest talent in the world.
We'll put
But
me and you on the same team, Jack.
that's the deal. I did love running though, and when Omo talks about the freedom that one feels of running, I was actually captain of the track team for a year in a white suburb of Chicago, and it gave us a chance to outside of the classroom to do something that was about something that we might have a chance of doing well at, other than what the classroom situation was regimented as. And part of the work I've done is looking at the eugenics movement and IQ tests and all that, which was really a way of sorting people out. So in many ways, people were already sorted into certain classrooms and very regimented. So sports was not quite ranked that way. It was a freer area where people could really achieve and discover what they could really do outside of that regimentation.
Mhm, mhm.
Yeah, just building on that, we also spent a lot of time swimming and, we were the only Black folks on the swimming team. But what we learned there, we had a great coach who was preparing all of the swimmers to be Olympic level swimmers. So we got Olympic level training. And what I learned was just to push my mind, my body beyond its physical limitations. And to be able to imagine myself doing something that I didn't think was possible, and then training and being able to achieve that. And so, when I think about sports, I think it's really an opportunity, particularly for Black boys. And I think about basketball is like, how do you learn how to push yourself beyond what you perceive as whatever your limits are? And how can you imagine yourself doing something and then actualize that? And I think that's something that we need to experience and then to apply in, whatever else we're passionate about.
Do you think that same philosophy applies to math?
Yeah, we got to get the kids turned on to math at an early age, get them excited, and for them to see themselves as math people. I think every kid, if you provide them with a fun, engaging math experience, they're going to enjoy it. They're going to want to come back to it. They're going to see themselves as math people, and math is something that is part of their everyday lives, part of their community, part of their culture, part of who they are. And then it becomes a tool for them to achieve something, versus, or a tool for them to create something, a tool to construct something, or a tool to deconstruct something, versus, something you have to do to perform well on a test. Yeah.
It's
Absolutely.
funny because math, of course, is one of the stereotypes that a lot of Asian kids get tagged with, and part of what people who kind of follow Asian students and how well they do is that it's done collaboratively. It's done with the family, it's done with friends, and people study together. Whereas in the traditional Western US school system, working together is seen as cheating, right? But in fact, the joy and pleasure of it is really doing this kind of problem solving together, so these stereotypes kind of go all sorts of ways, and I think it's brilliant that Omo's dad and now Omo have been doing this project in a way that really gets people excited about something that they're generally kind of boxed out of, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it struck me. One of the interviews with the Algebra Project with the student named Cookie, right?
Yeah.
And what I took away, I mean, there's so much that you could take away from that student's story, but it really, a fun first read reminded me of The Wire.
Hmm.
Because there's so many, and in the TV show The Wire, there's so many instances where, you're seeing students who are not excelling in school applying the very same principles to their work on the street. Um, and making sense of the world around them with those same tools, just applying them differently. And so, yeah, I guess like when you think about students like that, what is the message you want to give them about shifting their mindset in that way?
Yeah. Now, I'm glad you mentioned Cookie, aka Sammy Myers. I'm the only one that gets to call him Cookie, but now you've called him Cookie, so we got two people that can call him. But I was just in Mississippi, and he called me. He's like, "When you getting in?" I was like, "All right, I'll be in the morning." He came and picked me up, drove me through the neighborhood, and just wanted to show me how well he's doing and how he's managed to find a way for himself against all odds. And he has a job with the city of Jackson. He owns a couple properties. He took me to the property that I used to go pick him up in. And, he was saying that a lot of folks don't understand like where he really came from and the things that he was struggling with. But you know, my dad felt like, well, if you can get Sammy, if you can get Dusty and these young people um, to do well in school, these are the folks that the school is trying to dispose of. They're trying to get them out the building. They're not invested. They don't believe that they can play a different role in society. They're trying to push them to jail or something else. And so the one thing about Sammy was like he said he learned how to learn. And so that was his biggest thing. And so he learns at his own pace. He had to figure out, like through the algebra project and his work with the young people's project, how he can learn things, and then being consistent. My dad would always say, keep on pushing. And so Cookie, he's an example of just being persistent, learning how to learning, figuring out ways to do that. But he's also, the other thing I just want to mention about him, he's a father. And so it's amazing how he's taken what he's learned and applied that to becoming a dad. And now his kids, are really successful. And so this is a young person who the school system was like, nah, you shouldn't really be here. We're not invested or gonna invest in educating you and you being a functioning member of our society. And so I think my dad was always interested in like, how can we get those young people that the school system, that society is ready to discard and invest in them in a way that shows that, they can be part of society and there are different ways that they can contribute.
Mhm. Absolutely. So I want to remind our audience that we would love to hear from you all. Any questions you have, you can use the Q&A function here on Zoom to submit them. We already have one from Anne that I'll put to you too. Anne says, we need freedom summer young people to return in these times. They should be an inspiration for our activism today. Don't you think so?
Absolutely. And my mother was part of SNCC, Cortland Cox, Judy Richardson, when I was in DC, Joyce Ladner, they're still with us. My dad's passed on, but there are a lot of folks that are still with us. And if you check out the SNCC Legacy Project, you can connect to the stories of Amzie Moore, Ella Baker, the experiences of June Johnson, all these young people that were organizing and active in the 60s, and they've created toolkits so that this generation can learn from that generation, but also, there's a precedent that they've set to try to, go from protest to power. And, that's available, and some of those folks are still with us. And so I would encourage us to tap into them while they're still here and tap into the resources that they've created so that this generation can pick up where they've left off.
Yeah, I mean, I just to build on that, I mean, the African American experience in this country has really been kind of breaking the pathway, as well as Indigenous peoples, breaking the pathway about how freedom and how progress can really be made for people who have been excluded. And so for me, the whole uh, understanding and insight that organizing and cooperation are key, as opposed to oftentimes what we learn in school is, well, there's social Darwinism, it's survival of the fittest, and only the fittest can be really rise to the top. And that's really uh, such a divisive approach towards how young people learn and how they shift from learning cooperatively when they're younger to how they increasingly become competitive in a way that begins to make them think that they're superior to one another, or they're inferior, or they're degenerate. All these terms that are still used to this day. And I'm just hoping that we could develop school systems and cooperative kinds of learning situations, which are really nurturing and not divisive in that way. And I'm hoping that as we move into the near future, we can start really, kind of organize and cooperate in that same spirit, because we're in for some tough times in terms of the spaces, like the basketball courts, or the places that people can really thrive as well.
Mhm. Uh, Jack, that is a perfect segue into a couple questions we have here. First one is from Anthony, who's saying, Omo, being the founder of Math Talk, have you read and can you comment on Joe Bowler's book, Mathish, which deals with finding creative diversity and meaning in mathematics? She talks that many students fail in math because it is generally taught one way, the wrong way, and that there are many different ways to teach and engage students in order for them to succeed.
Yeah, I haven't read her book, but I'm definitely familiar with her work. And yeah, I mean, I think, we go in with our work with the assumption that, young people can do math, and there are many ways to do math, and, you know, trying to figure out ways in which we can help young people begin to see math as something that enables them to better understand, things that are important to them, or to achieve outcomes that are important to them. The other thing that I think is important is, pulling from the Algebra Project, they really thought about, how can we help young people learn math from a context that's familiar, through their own common language, through everyday experiences. And so rather than centering math on something that's unfamiliar, how do we build mathematical understanding from things that you do, or from people and places that, you interact with. And so, I think there are a lot of similarities between what the Algebra Project has done and Joe Bowler's work, and, what we're doing at Math Talk, and the things that she espouses.
Mhm. And as a follow, and Jack, I want to get back to kind of our current moment, but we do have a follow-up from Jackie here, who's noting, for the general public, it'd be good to share that your father won the MacArthur Genius Award because of the Algebra Project. And he goes on to say he really felt that knowing math that originated from Africa would be a powerful bit of knowledge and tool for freedom, and this stems also from his Mississippi background. Can you share with people how to learn more about the Algebra Project?
Yeah, go to algebra.org, definitely do that. And so he won the MacArthur Award, and that allowed him to begin working in the King Open School and coming into my sister's classroom and teaching math. And so he developed the Algebra Project um, after he won the actual MacArthur Award. And so the MacArthur Award is what enabled him to do that. And the Algebra Project is still going strong. You can check them out online. And, I think it's a testament to just the power of his legacy, and, the fundamental ideas that he was embracing. And, I was just in San Francisco, and there were about 15 Algebra Project teachers and former teachers that came out, and they all talked about um, his ability to transform how they approach teaching and learning and working with students, and really seeing, the classroom as a meeting space. It's not a space for a teacher to tell you what to do, but it's really a space for people to come together, to have a conversation, to deconstruct and construct knowledge, to debate, and to try to build consensus. And so I think there are a lot of powerful things that are part of the Algebra Project that really grew out of his experience in Mississippi. And he, tried to replicate that in the classroom, so that the classroom and learning math could be a liberating experience.
Mhm. And Jack, we segued into this talking about our current moment and the challenges that are ahead of us over the next few years. We have a couple questions from our audience pertaining to the landscape of DEI right now, the attack on DEI. And folks are just asking, how do we combat that and continue to honor and teach history like the Moses families and yours, but then also go in a new direction that empowers everyone and galvanizes everyone to work together.
Yeah, knowledge by itself, in isolation, um, can be divisive. Math can be used as in algorithms in a lot of the social media in a divisive way, or in a way bringing people together. Um, History can be used in a divisive way by emphasizing wars, conflicts, the great man theory of history, versus understanding that we're all a part of history. and that there are many stories to be told, and many stories together are what make things happen in society. Democracy in that way is not just some word, but it's really about people working together and cooperating and talking things out in those spaces where there can be some freedom and shared interests and shared work. So I think what's at stake here is really the future of knowledge and how we can build a culture and society together, how we can honor and respect each other's differences, no matter where we come from, versus a constant process of sorting and domination. So I'm hoping we can do that. And even when the larger kind of forces are against us, there's so much to learn from the grassroots efforts, such as the Algebra Project, such as indigenous communities relearning their languages, reclaiming their languages and their ceremonies and songs. So, you know, uh, it's a tough time right now because so many of the programs seem to be, including maybe the Department of Education, on the chopping block. So where are people going to learn? I do have a faith that we can do it ourselves as well. Of course, we need the support for these things to happen, but we have to also organize and cooperate, and that'll be the key for us getting through this time period.
Mhm. And Jack, we spoke a little bit about this when we were preparing, because we talked specifically about the relationship between Blacks and Asians in America, given the nature of the conversation we're having tonight and the experiences that you and Oma both bring. And we have a question from Noham. I hope I'm saying some variation of correct pronunciation there, but who's asking, can you suggest strategies for gathering together different peoples of color who have not to date worked as closely together as they should, or could, strategies for developing a sense of commonality, especially outside of academia and activism? And it certainly ties into the very layered, complex, and historic relationship between Blacks and Asians.
Yeah, I mean, there's deep unacknowledged experiences, shared experiences between Blacks and Asians. A lot of it has to do with the historical conditions that we both emerged from, and Black enslavement and liberation, but then also that entering into a period of exclusion and Jim Crow segregation. Those shared experiences really are part of the shared history that we actually have. I think the same could be said about how Black and Indigenous peoples have a deeply and shared, entwined history as well. Certainly in the making of New York City and how Indigenous peoples were pushed off the land, but quite frankly, we don't really learn about that in New York City curriculum or New Jersey curriculum that much. And then how related to that, once the land, once Indigenous people were separated from the land and taking care of the land in the way that they had been tending the wild, in effect, um, enslavement was part of what happened in terms of kind of the ownership of those same shared pieces of property. And then part of the sharedness of the history is that as let's say the white cedar forest that is now the Meadowlands was basically cut down. The trade that was being developed in the New York area was really to trade globally, and part of it was to trade with China, for example. So these are all intertwined histories that we tend not to understand. But I think the more we understand them, the more we realize that our everyday lives are really, kind of connected in really important ways. And people then get to know each other in important ways, in terms of growing up with each other or on the basketball courts or whatever it may be.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd just like to add to that. I was blessed to be part of the Gathering for Justice, which was something that Harry Belafonte organized, I think around 2005, 2006. And so he would bring communities of folks to different parts of America. And so, I met John Mohawk at the Onondaga Nation at a gathering, it was myself and probably 100 other young people and elders that came there went there for 2 days and gathered with them and began to build relationships. And he did something similar in the South. He did something in Appalachia. He did something in the Latino community. And I just remember how powerful it was to build community within community, but across communities and to begin to build those relationships. And so, I think we need to think of ways in which we can gather, both within our communities. I think Black folks need to gather. We've been assimilated and dispersed and integrated, and we can't really tap into all of our genius and resources. And so, how do we gather as a Black community, but also how do we gather across communities to really build relationships? And so, I think SNCC is also an example of that, of ways in which folks have gathered. Sorry, the lights went out.
Here.
Like, what happened to the lights? Wave my hand. But yeah, I think SNCC is another example of that, of people gathering across communities and building relationships and shared leadership. And so I think that's vital. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And
Um, One of the things I've been learning from indigenous folks that I've been working with is really the deep shared approach towards nature that I was brought up with from my mom and Chinese culture, in which, those Chinese landscape paintings, and they're kind of the mountains, and, they're gigantic, and the rivers are, there. And then the people are tiny, tiny little people that maybe you can see in the far distance, right? And that really is a strong message that we as children get in terms of, well, nature and place is really powerful, and that it's not like the giant person with the little trees in the background or the cut trees in the background. And what I've been learning is that the indigenous view of the world is really deeply respectful of place and nature in a way that's not so dissimilar to what I grew up with. So I think once we have a chance to actually learn and exchange stories about those similarities, it begins to change our understanding of each other as well. So,
mm-hmm, absolutely. And there's an acknowledging too, like Omo, you alluded to this, but Jack, we know this to be true for that there no Black people and Asian people are not monoliths. There's so many sub communities and cultures within those identities that have healing to do over their own too. And so that solidarity is really important on the nuance level. And I'm curious, in this moment, I mean, we're in a pretty dark time. I think everyone could agree with that. Um, how are each of you experiencing this individually, given the identities you show up with every day?
Yeah, I was saying earlier, I've kind of unplugged. And so I get my news from my mom and The Guardian.
Yeah.
But it's like, I'm like, put my head down and let's do the work. And again, part of the work for me has been with this book. I'm going out and reconnecting with people. I'm creating space for honest and tough conversations and ways for people to come together that are counter to kind of, as Jack was saying, kind of this divisive tone and that we see in our country. And so I think, those are one of the, that's part of what I'm thinking about. I also think about, my dad and his statement, keep on pushing. And, he would sign all his emails with KOP, keep on pushing. And I think there's also, precedent for how to push, and so again, thinking about, my mom hosts the annual Bob Moses conference, and I think that's an opportunity from her perspective to bring people together to keep pushing, SNCC is doing stuff to keep pushing. I know, Jack, you're doing a lot of work. And so I think there are ways in which we can find ourselves confronting what's going on in this moment. And I think there's a lot of precedent for how to do that.
And Omo, will changes in what we're seeing in the current administration affect your funding or otherwise affect the work that you're doing in any way?
I don't know. We'll see. I mean, I'm sure. I mean, once they froze federal funding, everyone's like, that's affecting everyone. But I mean, I think it also forces us to think about, well, what did Black folks do coming off the plantation? You know what I mean? What did Black folks do post-Reconstruction? What did Black folks do during Jim Crow? How did we survive and thrive? And I think we need to begin to go back and do some of those things as a community. I think one of the things is how do we ensure that our kids are going to get a quality education and not turn them over to the school system? So what do we have to do to ensure that our kids get the education that they need? Also, how can we have a different relationship with this country's kind of economic arrangements and have some kind of economic independence and self-determination. And so there was a reason that Amzie Moore and E.W. Steptoe, these are businessmen, these are farmers, these are people that have some level of autonomy that enables them to support young people to be active in movement. And so I think for me, I think about that, how can we be more independent and build bridges across communities versus relying on these systems to work, which have failed us in many different ways.
And
I,
Jack?
yeah, I think so much of the culture today is, especially social media, but also the way marketing happens, is that it's very addictive. It's very addictive. So we want to have those snacks, and we want to have those things that are advertised so much, but then we also want to stay slim, so people get addicted to dieting and also addicted to eating lots more junk food, right? So it becomes a vicious kind of cycle. That's in some ways kind of an example of so much of what else is going on to really um, extract from people what their desires are. And we know that that kind of extraction doesn't really satisfy our needs. I mean, eating lots of potato chips is kind of pleasurable in the short term, but it comes back to bite us in the end. So what can we do to create a more satisfying culture that's not strictly based on being addictive, but really deeply satisfying and deeply connecting? I really, as I've come to learn more about Ella Baker, for example, and I know Ella Baker is someone who was so involved in SNCC and was really someone who was so strategic and so much of a leader. Part of what she did is she created cooperatives, on the land, right?
Mhm.
And it's oftentimes in those kinds of settings that I think we start feeling that we can actually do something and do something together. They may be small things, but the small things do add up. And it also just reinforces a sense of true connection with people. So I'm kind of looking forward to doing more of that and being less dependent on the kinds of systems that oftentimes addict us and put us off against each other. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah. No more scarcity, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Abundance over everything.
And getting outside more and walking around trees and
Yes.
ocean more
Yes.
and mountains, right? So we need all that. Yeah.
Healing through nature.
We
Yeah.
learned that during COVID, but it's so easy to forget that lesson, right? Yeah.
100%. 100%. We've got just a few minutes left here, but we have some really interesting questions and comments. Ophira is commenting, first saying thank you, but then also saying, I grew up in the Mississippi Delta. The ancestors did push back with no funding, and so will we. We must. KOP.
See?
And then we've got a question from Java who's asking, Jack's opinion on the recent action by 100,000 plus Americans to join Red Note, the social media platform, and engage with Chinese people. They say, I am one, and we are exchanging ideas, recipes, language, culture, etc. They are asking us questions about what's going on right now and trying to understand. It's been beautiful. And I've been able to talk about the White Peril and the Yellow Peril with some folks.
Yeah, I mean, I think a big lesson that certainly I know Bob Moses had learned during the anti-war movement. I'm younger than your dad, but understood the same thing, that we have to separate people from governments or people from the corporations. And any chance we have to learn and directly communicate with people. So I don't think those recipes that my grandma has and that your grandma has are somehow embedded with secret messages that are going to ruin both the, China or United States or Africa. I think there's certain things that we can share and exchange that really are about genuine communication from the heart. And so I think that's part of the fear factor, part of the paranoia, part of the anxiety that is being generated, so that it's perceived that any kind of interaction that we have is dangerous, across Americans and differences of Americans, but across countries as well. Um, yeah. Um, yeah. People have no problem in touring France or London, Paris. But to say that you're going to go to Africa, oh, for a safari, or to Asia, oh, what restaurant did you go to? All of these kinds of things are so betray a certain kind of lack of understanding, lack of experience and exposure.
Well, this has been excellent. There's so much more we could discuss, but I see Mary appearing on screen, which means my time is done. And but I do want to say a big thank you to you both, to Omo and Jack, and to all of our audience members for this wonderful discussion. And Mary, I will turn it, and to Cambridge Forum, of course, and to GBH's Forum Network. And Mary, I will turn it back over to you.
Well, I hope I'm speaking for the entire audience that was really a marvelous discussion. I learned a lot. It was very rich to get the cross-cultural input on things that you don't necessarily think about and equate. Very, 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 very helpful and interesting, and lots more questions. So the book, I haven't read your book, Jack, but I've certainly read Omo's book. Highly recommend it. It's an interesting mix of kind of memoir and history and anecdote and all sorts of stuff. It's an interesting book. Okay, so thank you to Omo Moses. Thank you to Jack Tchen. Thank you very much to Paris Alston for moderating a great discussion and giving of your time and expertise today. I want to thank you all for joining us today and for your comments and your interest and supporting the forum. And I look forward to seeing you all in 2 weeks. Thank you.